Hey Cycle 2 TPAers, welcome or welcome back to TPA Cafe. I'm a CalTPA coordinator, and in this video we're going to talk about the 5 most common reasons, at least that I have seen, patterns that I have seen, reasons why people are not passing, even if they're close to passing but not passing their Cycle 2 CalTPA. Number 1, actually, and number 2 are going to be the same as my Cycle 1 video, but number 1 is rubrics, and you've heard me say it 1,000 times. Those of you that are my students, you know that I reiterate this so many times throughout the semester, but you absolutely must, there are 9 rubrics for Cycle 2. You absolutely must know the rubrics so very well, the criteria for success, backwards and forwards, and what it is that you need to demonstrate in each of your videos on your learning segment template in order to achieve at least a score of 3 or higher. And so some of the things I'm going to talk about as numbers like 3, 4, and 5 in this video have to do with the learning segment template. But in order to really nail a higher score on your Cycle 2 CalTPA, you have to know the rubrics. So print those babies out, grab a highlighter, highlight the score, the criteria for success for the score that you're looking for. Make sure that you are explicitly in your videos and in your learning segment template demonstrating that criteria for success in a very, very explicit way, because the assessors don't know you. They're not going to make assumptions. It's either you did it and it's obvious, or you didn't do it and it didn't happen. So you want to make sure that your rubrics, you're using those puppies as like your basis for success, and that you know them super well, because the candidates that know the rubrics super well are the candidates that tend to elicit the higher scores on their Cycle 2 CalTPA. Number 2, and this kind of goes along with my Cycle 1 number 2, which is answering all of the questions and prompts in full. So the people that score the lower scores on their learning segment template, and this is huge because the learning segment template kicks it off, right? It kicks off your TPA. You have your contextual information template, but then you have the learning segment template, which is the foundation of the rest of your TPA. It's your lesson sequence. It's so important. So there are several boxes on that learning segment template that you need to fill out. And the most common reason that people are getting scores lower than a 3 on this template is that people are not filling out the box. They're not completing the boxes with what they're asking you to talk about. So so first of all, we know just from, if you've seen any of my videos, you cannot be vague in any way. We have a multiple subject. We have Cycle 2 samples. Your programs all have access to these. So you can ask your TPA coordinator. If I'm not your TPA coordinator, if I am, you have access to the samples. But the multiple subject math sample happens to be, in my mind, particularly strong when it comes to the writing piece. And so really looking at the sample, seeing how she does her writing, there's a huge amount of intentionality around her writing. But I would say, like, there are some boxes that say things like, what are your instructional strategies address the UDL guidelines that you're using? Well, there are people that will do their learning segment template and never talk about UDL. And so if it says talk about UDL and you just leave it out, you're not going to get a score of a 3 or higher. It's just not going to happen. So you have to be addressing everything they ask you to address in detail. When it asks you to talk about the student activities, you want to really detail out the student activities that you're doing. You know from probably other videos that I have made where I talk about giving evidence with claim evidence impact. That also works here. When they ask you to talk about student grouping, they want to know, what is the grouping you chose for each of the activities? Why did you choose it? How is it beneficial for the kids? That's claim evidence impact. When you talk about UDL, they're not asking you to necessarily go to the guidelines and talk about like the very specific number. I mean, you can, but like 7.2 point thing, they're wanting you to just talk about the UDL guidelines, multiple means of engagement, multiple means of representation, multiple means of action and expression. How are these happening in your lesson? How are you creating opportunities for students to engage in the various UDL guidelines? And really talking about that in detail. So if you just leave something out, you're not going to get the score that you want, because there's no, as you know, there is no lesson plan. You're not submitting actual lesson plans for Cycle 2. You're submitting this learning segment template, which is taking the place of your lesson plan. So do you want it to be super detailed? Absolutely. Do you need to put you want to put your rationale as to why you're making certain teacher moves and decisions? Absolutely. So we do not want to be vague. We want to answer all the boxes in full and make sure that we're really giving them the evidence that they're looking for. And that one thing, which seems, I know, kind of obvious, but it is one of the reasons that people tend to get some of the lower scores, maybe 2s when they're wanting 3s. And so you really need to make sure that you complete that learning segment template, like claim, evidence, impact, really giving them all the evidence they're looking for in each of those boxes. Number 3. So this is also about your learning segment template. In your 3 to 5 lessons that you're planning for cycle 2, and I've also mentioned this in other videos, there needs to be 2 types of alignment that will be taking place. There needs to be lesson alignment in terms of like your learning objective that you have. So a lot of people ask me, can I have the same standard for my lesson sequence, or does it have to be different standards for every lesson? You can have the same standard. You're planning basically a mini unit. It can be under the same standard or standards. That's okay. But what you cannot have, absolutely cannot have, is the same learning objective for more than one lesson. So learning objectives are daily learning objectives. Unless you are teaching the exact same lesson 2 days in a row, which none of you are, you would never have the same learning objective 2 days in a row. And so all of your learning objectives need to be different, but they also need to be connected to one another, building on one another toward higher order thinking. If you have learning objectives that are disconnected, if you have learning objectives that are not building toward higher order thinking, if you have learning objectives that are, those 2 things. I mean, really, it's those 2 big things. That learning objectives that are like the lessons are disconnected. So what they're doing in lesson 1 and lesson 2 doesn't build on what they did in lesson 1, and what they're doing in lesson 3 doesn't build on lesson 2, and etc. Or you have lessons that do not ask the students to gradually demonstrate higher order thinking. The other kind of alignment you need to have in your learning segment template is you need to have a really strong, well-crafted learning objective, SMART goal. And then the lesson that you have in the learning segment template needs to be 100% aligned to your learning objective, to getting the students to engage in the learning and demonstrate that learning objective. So if you have a learning objective and your lesson's going like all woo, like this, and not getting the kids, you're doing activities that are unrelated to your learning objective and things like that, that's one kind of alignment that we don't want. We want boom, learning objective, lesson is 100% supporting the kids to engage in the lesson and demonstrate your learning objective. And then you want the vertical alignment, and then you want the horizontal alignment, which is that your lessons all build on one another in content and in rigor. So that is one huge reason that the people that don't pass their Cycle 2 CalTPA come to me in remediation, and that is one of the most common things that I see is the alignment problem. So you want to have that vertical and that horizontal alignment. Number 4, and this is about step 3, reflect. So step 3 reflect is a reflection, but it's also an analysis of your formal assessment results. And so in your formal assessment results, so first of all, there's a table, and I show you in my Real Talk series how to kind of complete the table. You also have a model of this in the sample TPAs, but you have to, in that table should be the learning goal/goals, but goal from each of your lessons in your learning segment and your lesson sequence. But what they ask you to do is they really ask you to deeply reflect on the patterns and trends. So you've given this formal assessment, you've taught your lesson sequence, the summative/formal assessment is probably going to come at the end of that because it's summative. And it doesn't have to be, summative doesn't mean it has to be huge, enormous, needs to take an hour, certainly should not be multiple choice. I have my own whole school of thought around that, but needs to be, the children demonstrating your learning goals from the lessons that you taught in your lesson sequence. But summative should be higher order thinking, digging into the content, but not necessarily doesn't have to be something that takes forever. And so one of the things they ask you to do is, you give the formal assessment, you have the results from your students, and then what they want you to do kind of in depth is analyze the patterns and trends that you have seen, that you see in your formal assessment results. What are the learning goals that the students are really, really understanding well from your learning sequence, kind of embedded in that formal assessment. But where are the areas that you're seeing that you could maybe do some reteaching, or that you feel like students are really getting it, and why? Give the evidence, give student responses. And one of the things that happens in this section when it says talk about the patterns and trends, things like that, is people are not necessarily kind of deep diving into the patterns and trends that they're seeing, and they're not. And if it says things like give student assessment responses, some people aren't giving responses that their students wrote on their formal assessment. And so they want you to give evidence. And so in giving that evidence, again, it's like claim evidence impact. It's giving, if you're making a claim about how something went and a pattern and a trend, give the evidence. And so this section, oftentimes the thing that gets people, the main pitfall here is that people are just too vague in how they're describing the patterns and trends. They really kind of want you to do a deep dive analysis into how did the kids do? Why do you think they did well? What do you think that, which instructional strategy really helped them? Which instructional strategy do you think you could improve upon? Like, they really want you to reflect in that way, in a really evidence-based way. So just making sure that in that form, in that step 3 reflect, that it's not just like I think it went well. I think this was good. I think this strategy was helpful, but like really nailing that claim evidence piece around like, this is what I'm seeing. This is the trend that I'm seeing. This many kids did this. This many kids did this. This seemed to be really strong in terms of an instructional activity and got the students to demonstrate this thing. I really felt like the students nailed this thing, and here's the evidence. So that's how you want to be writing on your step 3 reflect. You want to be giving that kind of claim evidence, really deep dive analysis into why you feel like the formal assessment results kind of went the way that they did, what are you seeing and why, and all of that. So that should be helpful when you go to do your step 3 reflect, just to kind of avoid that vagueness and really be able to jump in and dig into that question when they ask you about the patterns and trends. Number 5, and this is about your reteach or extension activity. So you've taught your lesson. First of all, your reteach or extension activity needs to not be part of your original 3 to 5 lesson sequence. If it is, you will get a condition code. It needs to be planned after you taught your original sequence. You did your 3 types of assessment. You analyzed the student results. You looked at the data and all of that. And then you make the decision about what you're going to be doing in terms of a reteach or extension activity. And I know I've said this in other videos, so this is probably nothing new to most of you. Whether you do a reteach or extension, that is completely up to you. They're not looking at necessarily the choice that you're making, but you need to know the rationale behind the choice that you're making. So obviously, if you make a very misaligned choice, like all the kids demonstrated your learning goals, but you are going to do a reteach. I don't think I've ever seen that happen, to be honest. So I don't think anybody would do that. But you just want to make sure that you have a clear rationale for why you're doing a reteach or why you're doing an extension. Now, if you do a reteach, and you have to have a very clear rationale for why you're choosing what you're choosing, and you need to make that very clear in your step 4 apply. The other thing is that with the reteach, you need to be talking about the new approach you're taking to teaching the content again if you're doing a reteach, because obviously if you taught it in one way and the kids and the students did not understand, you're not going to take the same approach again. So they want to know, what is the approach you're going to be taking? What's the new approach? And why are you taking this new approach? So again, I really feel like, again here, claim evidence impact, like here's what I'm doing, here's why I'm doing it, here's how I feel like it's going to benefit the kids. If you choose to do an extension, and this is the tricky part that gets people a lot. If you choose to do an extension, it needs to be a true extension of the children's learning from your original lesson sequence. It can't be something that's too close to what you just taught. Meaning, when I say too close, I mean like about the same, like pretty much the same thing as what you just taught. It needs, if you're going to do an extension, it does need to be building on your original sequence, but it needs to be extending the children's learning. So again, the TPA is all about, do you know how to structure lessons that are connected to and building on one another? So your extension needs to be an extension of learning from what you just taught. So yes, it's connected to and building on your original sequence, but it's an extension. It's going deeper. It's challenging the kids to think more deeply about the content. It's more higher order thinking. So if you kind of skew the other way, and what you do for an extension activity is like more lower order thinking than your lesson sequence, that's not going to work. That's not an extension. So whatever you choose, just be very clear. What is my rationale around choosing what I'm choosing? Make sure that they know that in detail. And then if you're doing an extension, if you're doing a reteach, what is the new approach you're taking and why? And if you're doing an extension, you want to make sure that it's a true extension of learning, and that you know that it's really asking the children to go even deeper into the content doing more higher order thinking in terms of whatever content you're teaching and really building on your original lesson sequence. So friends, I hope you found that helpful. I wanted you to know some of the things that I typically see because I know that a lot of you are in the process of planning and filming for your Cycle 2 CalTPA right now. And knowing what tends to land people in remediation or get the lower scores, I think is just a really good way to make sure that you're kind of doing your double checking to make sure that when you're planning and filming for your Cycle 2 CalTPA, that you kind of know what to look for and know what to avoid. So I hope you found this helpful, and I'll see you all soon in another video. Happy TPAing.